planning, or are you in the midst of implementation of an AI solution? Or are you looking into another digital solution? Hello everyone, and welcome to the Thought Leader Chats. I'm Ronald van Loon, and today I moderate a panel chat with Victor Wykoff and David Herman, and we focused around how intelligent cognitive technologies could take your procurement to the next level, or as they like to say it at SAP, the next generation of procurement. As a data scientist with SAP, they share their goals when working with companies to develop AI strategies and share some of the hurdles companies often face as they begin to expand their companies to compete in an increasingly digital world. So let's now turn to the panel.
If you talk about, let's say, intelligent procurement, the question, of course, is why are we doing this? And if we look to the current world, there's a lot of pressure from the end clients who want to have really a great customer experience. And what you see as well is that there's constant innovation required. And what we see in the supply chain is that every step in the supply chain now gets connected. And in each step, you can collect data. Data from every device, data from every person, data from every business. And then is the question, how can, let's say, data help in getting an intelligent procurement with the help of data and analytics? And if we look to the maturity, we were used to getting insights, getting reports, and then starting predicting all kinds of outcomes and start prescribing it and taking actions. But now we're moving into an area where it's really automated. So automated decisions. And this has a lot of impact. This has an impact for, okay, how are you going to collect your data? How is the quality of your data? How do you manage your governance? How do you process your data? But especially, how do you generate insights? If you're going to automate your decisions, what's the impact? What's the impact for your organization? What's the impact for your people? And what's the impact for the ethics within your organization as systems going to take any decision? And then it's, I think, the question with two respected guests who has a lot of experience in procurement, what is the opportunity that AI and that machine learning can bring us the coming years? So maybe start with you, Dave.
Sure, thanks. 2/3 of you tell us that so far, being data-driven has eluded you. That the ability to, as Ronald has just described, to derive outcomes from insights is beyond possible right now. And that as a result, you're not agile. This is a statement of the industry. It is in stark contrast to the market size for cognitive technologies, which is estimated to be $1 trillion by 2022. So there's a considerable gap in terms of what we know we need and how to deliver it, and how and what we think the expectation is. So that's at a macro level. At a more personal level, we talk to customers all the time about the need to deal with complex data that isn't well connected. A very good example of that is with catalog searches and requisitions. And when you look at the number of empty searches that come back, it's almost too much for a category manager to manage by themselves. So even finding the information, much less making recommendations, and even tracking and correcting that, and understanding who the users are and what their experience is. These are things that we provide through machine learning and artificial intelligence in order to solve the fundamental problem, Ronald, that you just mentioned.
Yeah. And then Victor, what's your view and your experience if you talk to clients? What are the opportunities? What do you see in your research that you're doing right now?
Sure. Well, I think that in my case, I've had some meetings with different parts of the Vivo organization, talking to the sourcing team, and then the procurement team, and then, of course, the invoice team. And all these teams are somewhat separated and in silos. And what I'm finding as I have more and more conversations with customers, as we work through our design plans, all of these things are connected. It's just one process. And I think that part of the reason it's still in silos is because we haven't thought about the data plan and how the data is going to travel from each of those steps all the way through, and then cycle back to the beginning again. So I find that the customers I talk to want to make those connections, want to use the information from step to step to then feed into improving their process as they go forward.
And then if we look to all the examples, there's a lot of opportunities with AI, with machine learning, and everybody thinks maybe quickly about automated driving, self-driving cars. But in the procurement, I think it's still not very known what are the capabilities and the possibilities, whether you think about auto classifications or using a chatbot saying, hey, buy me some nice pencils and give me the best pencils, or whether it's automated risk management or connecting all devices and giving you insights in the whole supply chain. What are typical use cases you see really occurring right now? And what are use cases that you expect the coming years? Can you give some examples? What type of use cases are really actual? Maybe
Sure.
Start with you again, Dave.
Yes. We're working with customers now on POCs that are related to chatbots, as just highlighted. The fundamental challenge that we're trying to solve in many of these is how to take the process of ordering across organizations and make it more consistent. So many of you from the registration data have either functional role or are change leaders. You're managing a transformation journey. And the fundamental work that we're trying to solve in many of these cases is to understand how to make the process of creating an order consistent so that it minimizes disruption throughout the rest of the organization. We spend a lot of time talking about efficiency in transactions, but efficiency in the initial experience and being able to make the experience consistent, make the requisition itself more consistent to drive higher quality and cost savings is a corporate goal. There's also an experience goal. The experience goal is how do I make a 5-star experience for a novice buyer who doesn't know your policies, who doesn't know how to even interact with the system. And what we're doing is we're building recommendation engines that look at your base of requisitions and finding, for example, the best supplier, or the one that has the best risk profile, or looking at the history of all the requisitions you've made and picking the right kind of historical requisition to get the best performance characteristic. So the example of chatbots is interesting because it has both organizational efficiency and workforce transformation at the same time.
And Victor, what type of use cases you see now or in the short future coming up?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because in the beginning, when I first started at Ariba about 2.5 years ago, the thought was that we'd come in and use the data to build some very predictive models and try to make the products better with intelligence. And what we found is that the data was stuck in a box that we couldn't get to very easily, either because it was difficult to pull the data itself from a technology perspective or because it was protected by legal agreements. And so what I see as one of the biggest opportunities is, frankly, just freeing the data to the customer themselves. So a lot of our customers come back and say, I just want my data. I don't need you to build anything. I just want to touch it. And Dave made reference to these null searches. And that seems kind of obvious. If you go into guided buying to go and buy something and you can't find it, that information should feed back into the procurement manager, the procurement professional, so they can improve the system. And we discovered that that very simple process of feeding that information back didn't exist. And so step number one is just to free the data and make it available to the procurement managers and to other folks. That's sort of persona number one, the folks managing the process. And then persona number two would be the user that you talked about and improving their experience.
And if I could add one thing.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned other technologies. We're not that far from mesh networks, for example. So where the computing is on the mobile device. Or today we look at our suppliers and we commonly ask things like, where are we shipping to? We don't think of the various points of presence that IoT brings to the equation. And the fact that we are just maybe a year or two from regularly seeing devices interacting with procurement processes in automated workflows. We're just not that far away from that. And in some industries, such as transportation, it's here already. Yeah. So drones, good example, drones ordering things based on image recognition is a viable approach right now.
And I have a question for the audience. Who's already applying machine learning or even advanced machine learning, deep learning into his procurement process? 1, 2. It's more or less a representation, I think, from research that your colleague did, Marcel Vormer. He presented yesterday where 15% of the companies currently apply machine learning and AI already in the procurement process. And then we start talking about, okay, why is it not 100%? What kind of obstacles companies are facing? And from this research came out that it's on one hand having the right talent, allocating budget, but one other important question was the data quality, how to get the right data. So, Victor, what type of challenges do you see with companies that are facing not starting with machine learning into the procurement process?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple challenges. Number one is just trusting the process, trusting that your data will be protected, and having those legal agreements in place to allow using your data to do the right thing. And that's not only on the customer, but it's also on Ariba to be able to create those processes whereby you get the proper legal documentation in place, you create the proper pipelines that are protected from human eyes back and forth. A very good example of this would be some of the work we're doing with contracts right now. Contracts are highly sensitive documents, and our customers don't want any human eyes to see them except for their own legal departments, which is completely understandable. So we've spent some time building a pipeline that protects them, shuttles those documents from the Ariba database to a second party that enriches those documents and sends them right back to the Ariba database, not to be seen by any human eyes, but enriched with very important information that can be used to basically create a contract manager.
Yeah, so I want to dive a little bit more deeper into all kinds of challenges. Maybe you can give some more challenges that you're facing.
So one of the big challenges that we're facing is what is going to become of our workforce. So it's common to go out and hire some PhDs and say, I now have a data science team. The problem is, if they don't have domain knowledge, if they don't understand your business, they tend to fail. In other words, we never get beyond the experiment, right? The research effort or the experiment. So it's important that as we build our organization and think about how procurement is going to transform as it goes to a self-driving concept, where many of our processes are automated, it's important to recognize that we're going to need more people who are involved in training and maintaining the things that we're building. These are not engineers, although they can be data engineers. It's a much broader scope of people, and really it's important to begin to bring those people into these conversations as we're beginning the re-engineering process. So what we find in many cases is that our customers tell us about the internal lack of access to the fundamental data that they're going to use for training, and a huge variety of different processes that are very inefficient. The work we did with Celonis is really important because it shows how you can discover and you can mine the process and feed your staff the information they need to apply their knowledge and also to educate data scientists.
Sorry.
I was going to add something to that. You mentioned Celonis, and I think it's also a great example of how we can start to learn how to do things faster. I would wager that 95%, maybe even 100% of the customers here would say, hey, this is happening too slowly. And part of the reason for that is because Ariba doesn't have the internal speed to do everything at once. We need to be able to start partnering with customers and partnering with partners, freeing them to be able to co-innovate with us and even innovate on their own and then provide solutions to our customers.
And I think, Ronald, I was also going to say, bias is something that we are very concerned about. So we talked about this base of requisitions I mentioned earlier, and we build these models based on all of your requisition activity. Great. So that means we're going to follow a template. We're going to follow a policy, assuming that there is no bias in your procurement activities. But what if there is?
There's always bias.
There is always bias.
Always bias.
Right. And it may be there at the beginning, or it may show up in the months and years afterwards. So you ask, what are the problems we're looking at? It's how do we manage bias? How do we make sure that ethics plays a role where it should? For example, with personal information, so PII. How do we make sure, as Victor has mentioned, that the governance and lineage is built into the platform itself? So you can't have continuous learning without solid lineage and data controls. And that has to exist from the beginning.
And then if you look how to manage bias as good as possible, you can have diverse teams, you can teams controlling each other. What are specific items where you think, okay, these are practices that we can share, how to manage bias as best as possible?
one area that I think is a very good place to focus on is business with purpose. So let's say we're interested in focusing on our supply chain and minimizing use of slave labor in the supply chain, right? So part of what you want to do is be able to understand where that exists, to measure whether whether we're seeing changes over time, and to benchmark ourselves. So one of the key capabilities that we think is important is building benchmarks and sharing information and participating in organizations like the UN Global Compact, so that we can collaborate and we can evolve best practices. Those best practices help us with bias.
And if we with regards to, let's say, human talent, what kind of best practices do we have? What is your experience in this?
In terms of capturing the right talent to do the job?
Yeah, so it's capturing the right talent, educating the right talent, keeping up to speed. So it's different kind of aspects. It's organizing it, creating the right culture. So there's many aspects where we have the challenge, I think, with talent.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the culture is so important, and you see it in every company, especially when you have silos. If you so SAP has something they call build the bridge. And I think that a lot of companies could use that too. And the thing about what they mean by build the bridge is, work with other people, collaborate, reach out, make that contact. Don't work in a silo. Don't work where you think you're doing something and no one else is doing it. And if someone else is doing the same thing as you, talk to them and figure out how to work through it. But the thing about building bridges is you have to remind people of it every single day. And if you don't do that, then people just, I think maybe it's a natural human quality to just move and focus on your own thing and want to get it done without anyone else, or maybe within your team. And so I think that's the biggest challenge is having a senior leadership team, which I think we have at SAP and at SAP Ariba, that really prioritizes that idea of building bridges.
And then we were talking about ethics. I think ethics is very important, especially if we move into the domain of automated decisions, because what's ethical, what's not ethical. On one hand, I think we have the data storage, which data is ethical to store, which is not, how to be transparent. And on the other hand, what kind of algorithms can we build, and what is the bias, what's accepted, what's not accepted. Can you give some more examples from ethical cases where you need to think of if you go into such a journey?
Well, a good example is if you look at your supplier base, or you look across supplier bases, there's a common occurrence of duplicate suppliers. And so we're working on algorithms that work differently than many other reinforcement learning. In our case, the machine asks the domain expert questions in order to derive basically a practice that it can use for identifying what is a common supplier in your supply base, so that maybe you can consolidate them. Very common in mergers and acquisitions or divestitures. And so we've been building these tools, and as we sit and observe domain experts training, we find that they train the systems very, very differently based on their own particular belief systems. And it's all fuzzy stuff. It's all human judgment, which is why we built the system, was to learn from that human experience. But you can see how from the very beginning, it almost has to be a panel of people who discuss the decisions as you're training the system, and then as the system evolves, you have to also include that expert panel in the discussion.
Do you have more examples, Victor?
Well, not to mention the customer too, right? So a really good example of that is when we were building these recommendations for guided buying. We wanted the user to be able to go in and find what they needed quickly to get their job done or build their product. And we fed that information back to the procurement manager at the customer and said, well, what do you think? We built this. It gives you a good retail-like experience. And the first thing he said is, there are too many things there I don't want my users to buy, right? You're giving too much randomization into the recommendations. And that's very, very good feedback. If you're Amazon, of course, you want to be able to encourage folks to browse. But in a procurement space, you want to encourage them to get what they need and get back to work.
Yeah.
And so, I think the customer feedback is also critical. And it might be different for different customers, but I think in procurement, that's rings pretty true.
And maybe a nice example, I was at Sapphire, what is it, 2 weeks ago, and I was sitting with a CDO panel, and the question was how to manage ethics if you start working with whole teams and with your organization, how to define this and how to give guidelines. So one CDO came with the example of having the newspaper example. So if you're not willing to publish it in a newspaper, what you're doing, what type of data you store, and what kind of algorithms you create, and what you're deriving from the algorithms, don't do it. And he gave a moral compass within his organization to manage and to guide his audience and his let's say employees what direction to take. If we look to the audience over here, we see that 2 companies are working with AI and with machine learning. What steps and what guidance would you give these 2 companies, but also the other companies? What should they do? What steps should they take to move into procurement with AI, procurement with machine learning?
So first, involve us early. We're in a stage where we believe these are the early days and that interaction is very beneficial. I participated in a roundtable with customers yesterday that was just incredible to listen to people sharing their experience with implementing something. And so that's something that we can help facilitate, and our partners and ecosystem can help us facilitate. So in addition to working with us, I'm talking about kind of a broader us. So not only are we SAP and SAP Ariba, but our entire ecosystem it brings a wealth of information and a real focus to design thinking, for example. And if you haven't participated in design thinking, we don't start from the premise that we're engineering a solution.
No.
We start from the premise that we're solving a problem that may or may not be software related in the end, or intelligence related at all. So sometimes you end up at the end of a design thinking session with an idea that is more organizational in nature. So I think you do that kind of thing. We have built and are introducing a continuous learning platform. We'll be making it available in the coming quarters. And we're interested in working with customers to see whether that can actually be applied to solve problems. We're not suggesting we know all the problems or all the, it's not as if we have to produce this exhaustive list of use cases. We have to have a conversation first.
Definitely. And Victor, what do you see?
Right. I think I would just build on what Dave said, which is to say that my goal is not to just build everything myself. My goal would be to help, if we talk with customers, in the case where it's possible to enable customers to build their own tools. It's not just about Ariba building stuff for you. I think you know what you want better, and if we can help you get there yourself, I think that's great.
And I think involving the audience, I think it's a good transition. Yeah. We're really curious what type of questions you have, so feel free to raise any questions. Who has questions? Who is facing challenges? Who wants to start? Who wants to ask the first question? You are already involved in the process. What are typical questions that pop up? Is the microphone?
Test. Okay. Yes, so my name is Mihail Sania. I'm from PepsiCo. We have started our journey, let's say, with this kind of technologies by implementing some chatbots for operational procurement, essentially automating some of our, let's say, help desk operations. And the way we approached that was a bit, let's say, gradual. So first we started by having the chatbot answering simple kind of frequently asked questions, how to, where to. The next step, which we are kind of doing right now, is to actually get data information from the system. So being able to answer also questions like, what is the status of my purchase requisition? Is this supplier available? Who's the next approval on the workflow? And so on. And then the next step, which is something that we are kind of envisioning to do in the future, is about getting the chatbot to actually put information in the system. So, for instance, actually asking the chatbot to create a purchase requisition or something similar, or do a good receipt or do an approval for you. So that's a bit the journey. And I think some of the challenges that we have seen, even internally in our organization, I think we are not kind of ready. We're not thinking about all the complexity. even simple things like, for instance, we need something like an internal robo ID, like in an organization, like in a solution, you have sort of an internal identification in your system, but you are a person. But then if you have a robot who's doing that, you need to have, like a robot ID that is able to, kind of connect into different system and take data and so on and so forth. And we didn't have that. So we kind of have to invent it, work with IT, with internal security in order to be able to build that. And then another challenge, it was about risk assessment. So we have, all this procedure about solutions, informatics solution, IT solutions, and how to do risk assessment for this, what are the type of risk associated with applications and so on. And we have to think about how to do that for a essentially automation, for a chatbot, for a robotics process automation. So these are all things that we are kind of learning our way through. To your point, we are working with, let's say, the broader ecosystem, so with some partners of yours in order to develop this kind of applications. And yeah, we're looking forward to see what else we can do. So we're very interested into learning more about future possible use cases and what we can do more.
Thank you for sharing your great case. I think it's marvelous. So if there's more people who want to share the case, yeah, please feel free. Maybe Dave, you want.
I was going to say,
yeah.
When I listened to your story, there are things that we're building that are more like tools than models. So, for example, we're adding a widget to our custom forms because we know that you're going to want to build the capability to interact with our models in ways that we can't imagine. We're working with IBM Watson to use, for example, Discovery News and their contracts intelligence and enrich those documents to start with the data and then give you the complete control over it. With chatbots in particular, not just programming them the way they were maybe a couple of years ago, but being able to interact through APIs is absolutely crucial. So an open API ecosystem is really important because you yourself won't have all the data. You may need to have data from other partners or customer systems or anywhere. So we're still, I think, in the early stages where those tools are being created and deployed. We know there's a need for it. More than 1 million forms, custom forms, have been created so far across the more than 400 customers. And this is just the very beginning. And risk, which is a favorite topic, happens to be a favorite topic of mine. So many different places. This could be fraud. It could be looking at supplier risk. You could be looking at compliance. You could be looking at market risk or product risk. So many different places to look. It's a really interesting space.
As David and Victor share their experience helping companies to digitally transform, we begin to see a few common challenges faced by data and tech teams. A few of the main challenges that they are focusing on and that they're seeing is ethical usage and storage of the data. So gaining positive outcomes with insights obtained from the data, but also getting a data science team that's both technically skilled and well educated on your brand, on your company goals, but also on the values of your company. So David starts off by acknowledging that 2/3 of the companies can't derive outcomes from insights, and that being data-driven has eluded them. A few driving factors for this are the availability, the accessibility, and the storage of the data. So before you begin to implement your plan, make sure your data science team is well versed in both your brand and your goals of your company. And many teams never leave the research and the experiment stage of AI development because data science teams have no brand knowledge. And this is costly and makes AI implementation seem out of reach. A group of Fortune 50 CFOs I spoke with gave me a really good ethics rules of thumb. So when it comes to data storage and to data usage. So if you would not publish what kind of data you are storing or what you are deriving from the data in the newspaper, then don't do it. It isn't enough for a company to say that you value privacy and security. You need to show what you do by building it into every facet of your AI and data models, and do it so transparently so customers may decide for it themselves. So remember to always keep your company's values in mind as you build and implement your data and AI strategies. If you would like to view additional resources on the topic, or if you seek guidance on the other aspects of your company's digital transformation, please follow the links below in the video. I'm Ronald van Loon, and this is the Intelligent World. Have you been planning, or are you in the midst of implementation of an AI solution? Or are you looking into another digital solution? Hello everyone, and welcome to the Thought Leader Chats. I'm Ronald van Loon, and today I moderate a panel chat with Victor Wykoff and David Herman, and we focused around how intelligent cognitive technologies could take your procurement to the next level, or as they like to say it at SAP, the next generation of procurement. As a data scientist with SAP, they share their goals when working with companies to develop AI strategies and share some of the hurdles companies often face as they begin to expand their companies to compete in an increasingly digital world. So let's now turn to the panel.
If you talk about, let's say, intelligent procurement, the question, of course, is